Welcome everyone to the Association for Social Economics webinar podcast series. Throughout the series, we will explore the profound and multifaceted impact of economics. This podcast series is sponsored by the ASE, whose mission is to foster research and publication centered on the reciprocal relationship between economics and the broader questions of human dignity, ethical values, and social philosophy. Each month, I get a chance to sit down and interview scholars in the field. I am your host, Iris Buder, and with me today, I have Dr. Aashima Sinha, research scholar at the Levy Institute of Bard College. Aashima is a research scholar in the Levy Institute's Gender Equality and Economy program. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Utah. Her research interests span the fields of feminist, development, and labor economics. She has worked on topics including micro and macroeconomic impacts of unpaid care work, assessment of public care policies and programs, time use surveys, the human development costs of violence against women, and international measures of gender inequality. She augments her research with policy evaluation and provides region-specific policy recommendations. Aashima's expertise includes designing and implementing primary surveys in developing countries. Notably, she conducted a unique contextualized time use survey in rural and urban areas of India. So thank you so much, Aashima, for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Iris, for having me.
So we're going to get started off by asking us, or me asking you, can you just tell us a little more about yourself, your background, and really what motivated you to get into the field of economics?
Sure. So before I start, I want to thank you and the Association for Social Economics for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure, and I'm very excited to be talking more with you today. Regarding my background, so I grew up in India and I completed my bachelor's and master's in economics in New Delhi in India. And I moved to the US in 2018 to pursue this PhD program in economics from the University of Utah. And right now, as you said, I'm a research scholar with Levy Economics Institute of Bard College. And my research mostly spans across feminist economics and development economics. And I also do a lot of social economics, trying to incorporate dimensions of social inequality in my research. So essentially, my economics journey actually started in high school. And I was always very curious and interested in topics of, economic development and economic policy making. And even if initially I was more interested in doing psychology, and that was the reason I opted for an art stream in India. But sooner I was getting more inclined towards economics, primarily because of its human development dimensions. And also, growing up in a developing country, I was kind of also observing a lot of social inequalities around me because India has so many social identities. And I was always interested in finding answers to the questions of, are there any linkages between inequality and economic growth and development? And also interested in different development trajectories of countries. And I think just in the quest of finding answers to a lot of these questions, I pursued my PhD journey further. And here I am, an economist right now. And I think what still keeps me really motivated is that I strongly believe that economics as a discipline has a huge potential to create an impact on the society in multidimensional ways. And that really motivates me to continue research in this field and also kind of try to contribute and engage more in policy making for overall development.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't know if we share this or not, but I actually spent my childhood in India as well, in New Delhi, which also motivated me to really think about economics, because if you see the social disparities, the health disparities and things like that on a constant basis, right, it makes you, I think, want to tackle those issues, right? So if you see it, right, it's one thing to talk about it, there's another thing to actually witness it and see it in action. So I can definitely relate to that.
Push. Yeah.
So in terms of your association with the Association for Social Economics, right? I'm curious to see or hear how you heard about the organization and really how you got involved with the ASE.
Right. So, of course, there were multiple times, multiple instances when I heard about ASE, but more seriously, I think it was during one of the American Economic Association's conference in 2023 in New Orleans, where we were a group of young scholars from IFE discussing about these organizations which are really pressing these social dimensions. And that was more seriously when I got to know about ASE. And then sooner after that, I think Jackie Strenio, who's a great friend, a mentor and co-author, she mentioned about ASE and about you. And that's when I read more about it, and I was very thrilled to see the vision of the American this Association for Social Economics, and also because my research interest and my research vision really aligned with the association's vision, which was to assess economic outcomes in the light of social interactions and cultural values. So that's when I decided, yeah, this is the perfect forum for me to become a part of it and interact more with like-minded people and push the boundaries of social economics. I am currently also engaging with one of the journals, which is Forum for Social Economics. So I reviewed a couple of papers there, and I want to continue working and actively getting involved in this association going forward.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So speaking of cultural influences, so how do you think cultural and societal values influence economic decision making, and how can we really better understand such dynamics?
Right. So very interesting question, and very close to my heart, because I always try to incorporate to a large extent the role of culture and societal values, including norms specifically, in my research. And I always kind of focus on doing some bit of a context analysis before I get into any kind of research. And if you really think about it, like, economics is actually a social science, right? And we are really studying individuals or economic agents who are definitely not homogeneous, or, but rather they are interdependent beings, and their behavior are really embedded in social structures, as we call it. So their decision making will be affected by a range of different players around them, a range of different dynamics in terms of the interactions between different sectors of the economy. So, the economic decisions taken within the household, a classic example, like a very basic decision people take within the household is who will be employed, what kind of employment will they take up, and the gender division of work between paid and unpaid work. So that kind of economic decision making that starts within the household is really guided by the social factors and the norms that are prevailing. So, the gendered roles that are defined within households or in the society really affects that very basic economic decision that starts within the household. And then that goes all the way to affecting a lot of macroeconomic outcomes. So the employment levels, the gender disparity in female labor force participation, even earnings gap or occupational segregation that we see around. So that is basically rooted, I would say, in those societal norms that prevail in the household or in the community. And if we look at it from a broader perspective, so even in the public sphere, even the political decisions that are taken, that really are affected by the cultural outlook of the government and the society. So because like I specialize in unpaid work and gender, I would give another example there, which is that when governments are making these fiscal decisions, it's a thing because the cultural outlook of many societies, even today, patriarchal societies in mostly low and middle income countries, the outlook is such that very organically, the unpaid work has been considered something to be taken place within the household and by women. And in this kind of a cultural outlook of the country or the government, there will not be some prioritization of redistributing this work from the household to the public sector by investing more in those public goods or care infrastructure, right? So those fiscal decisions, which are very primary economic decisions in that sphere, also gets affected by the cultural outlook of the government and also the society. And even like human development. So when we talk about culture and social values that brain map individuals' outlook towards investing in human capacity building, so investing in a girl child's education versus boy child's, that also varies a lot depending on the social structure that you're into. And that affects economic decisions of the next generation, let's say, spilling over to generation after generation. So culture and societal values, I think, have persisting effects on economic decision making.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in economics, of course, we have all our economic theories and models, everything we bring into the classroom, right? So how do you think economic theories and models account, or even fail to account really, for the social dimensions of these economic behaviors that you just talked about?
Right. So I mean, in my view, of course, economics, I think, like I am still a young scholar, I would say, but I think it as a discipline has really evolved over time to account for some of these social dimensions of economic behavior, maybe in very different ways, but to some extent, the recognition is there. Even though there's a long way to go, of course, but this recognition, I think, is also more common in perhaps heterodox tradition and feminist economics, social economics, and those schools of thoughts. They have very consciously included the role of social dimensions in economic analysis. And when we talk about theoretically, like in terms of theory, what progress have we made? I think since 1990s, there has been more active efforts on including social dimensions around race, class, gender, and these topics into macroeconomic policy making. And feminist scholars, even social economic scholars, they have really pushed for generating gender-aware approaches to macroeconomic analysis, and at different levels, at the conceptual framework level, at the level of formal modeling, at the level of empirical analysis, as well as policy. So there has been that recognition and push in the academic field to kind of incorporate those aspects. And even I think more formally, Marilyn Power in 2004, she has conceptualized the social provisioning approach so well that most of us, like feminist economists, are really relying on. I rely a lot on that framework, and she has very well incorporated the role of care work and unpaid labor as fundamental economic activities, of which gender norm is a part and parcel of, and also extending use of well-being as a measure of economic success, and incorporating economic and social processes and power dynamics in economic analysis, doing intersectional analysis, and inclusion of ethical goals and values also in these kind of economic analysis, which otherwise would not be considered economic topics. So I think theoretically there has been efforts going on, and growing efforts, I would say, around this. Even like other school of thoughts, behavioral economists and experimental economists, they are also doing quite a lot of work and interventions, randomized control trials, where they're trying to incorporate the role of social norms, mainly, and also trying to target a lot of these norms from early ages and so on. When it comes to economic modeling, I mean, in my experience, I haven't seen a lot, but I have built my work on one of these structuralist economic growth model of Bronstein, Stavrin, and Tavani, and they have really incorporated the role of gender and care work and an economic growth model. So even in terms of modeling, I think there are efforts, maybe not that widespread, but of course there are. Even Akram and Akram Lodi, they are also doing quite a lot of work in terms of modeling. So I do think that at the theoretical level, probably more, and even at the level of models, there has been recognition and inclusion of social dimensions, which has in a way also led to growing discussions in the policy space. So if you look at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, there is a push for inclusive development, taking into consideration a range of inequalities. So that way, it has really pushed something, I think, as a discipline, economics has been to some extent, but of course, there's a long way to go. And two primary reasons why I think economics is, failing to include social dimensions, or may not be accounting it for to the level it should be, is first, I think, primarily because of this the mental block that these are not economic topics. Why are we studying them in economics? These are probably sociology. Sociologists should study these topics. So that kind of a mental block really restricts the expansion of including social dimensions in economics. And secondly, also, on a more practical side, I would say the lack of data that we have in terms of social norms and culture, of course, not to say that data can capture these very well, but this lack of data on these social dimensions in a way restricts researchers, especially in the current outlook of the discipline, where there is more emphasis on quantitative analysis and econometrics. So I think that lack of data restricts researchers to include that in economic analysis. And I think one way to really push the boundaries to include these social dimensions is also to include mixed methods or more qualitative analysis that would really help kind of include these dimensions. In addition, meanwhile, there could be efforts to gather more data on norms and things like that. But I think there is really a lot of efforts that needs to recognize this work as something that could be affecting economic outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to turn our attention a little bit now to your research stream. So could you discuss your particular areas of research and really what motivates you to be involved in these particular areas?
Right. So I mostly try to apply a gendered lens and an intersectional lens to studying economic and well-being outcomes. So moving beyond just growth outcomes to include a range of other psychological and time allocation well-being outcomes. And within that, I focus on unpaid care work and its micro and macro level implications. And I have also looked into aspects of time use and time poverty very deeply, in addition to how gender norms could be affecting these allocations. I look at the broader concept of social reproduction and its linkages with economic growth as well. At Levy, I am mostly involved in studying time and income poverty. They have this very unique measure of calculating time and income poverty for people, for households. And that too we do through a gendered lens, including aspects of household production in that. And I'm also, as part of the team, also studying some public care policies and its impact on employment generation and time use of people. And overall, my analyses, as I said, is really motivated as set into the social provisioning approach framework. So taking care of care related topics and also expanding the definition of well-being. Conceptually, I've also used the capability approach in my research, and that really, I can talk about it more, but just briefly that this approach has really helped me assess the consequences of unpaid work in a very different setting, which is like restricting individuals' freedoms. And I also look at the impact of public space harassment affecting women's capabilities. And the motivation for studying these topics, I think, primarily, again, because I grew up in a developing country and with significant patriarchal norms around me and very significant gender inequality in sharing of paid and unpaid work, combined with limited access to public care provisioning. And because I've seen these things very closely affecting women's capabilities or freedoms in terms of their employment, their education, their earnings, and it came as a very natural topic for to me, like studying this unpaid paid work relation, but also how unpaid work could be affecting a range of other economic development outcomes. Also, I keep feeling that every day probably that there is a lot of gap in the literature in terms of studying these for the low and middle income countries who are also struggling with fiscal constraints and a lot of inequality. So really, I think studying these countries in detail and also the role of norms and culture in specifically these countries is something, a gap that I would want to kind of continue working on and researching more upon. So that really motivates me. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah. So we're going to link this paper in our show notes, but you have a paper in World Development that's titled Well-Being Costs of Unpaid Care Work, or sorry, Well-Being Costs of Unpaid Care, Gendered Evidence from a Contextualized Time Use Survey in India. And so in that article, in that paper, you use primary survey data really to examine the multidimensional consequences of unpaid care work through a gendered lens. So from that, I want to ask two questions to really dive into this research. So can you discuss, what is a time use survey and the process experience of survey implementation, really highlighting the role again of the social and cultural factors, and also what are some of these well-being costs that you mentioned, and what are your findings from this paper?
Good. Yeah, sure. I along with the team, I implemented this. We were fortunate to get some funding to implement a primary survey, which was a great deal for us during this graduate program. And a time use survey is really it's a survey that gathers data on individuals' time allocation in various activities on a daily basis. And it's a very helpful tool actually to understand people's constraints or the kind of trade-offs they make on a daily basis, and also the time poverty if they're experiencing any sorts of double burden of work or intensive work burden. So it's a very helpful tool in that way. And it's also helpful because it's also helpful if it's done in a gendered way, that is collecting this data for men and women and having that identifiers very clearly defined. And there could be multiple formats to collect time use data. And the most ideal one is doing it through a time diary approach. And that involves like giving a time diary to the respondents who will fill it themselves in 30 or 15 minute slots, what they did the entire day in a 24-hour, of course, time span, and they would report the kind of activities they were doing in those slots. Sometimes this is not very practically possible because there are literacy constraints, and also respondents might not be very seriously filling out the diary. So one of the tweaked way of this is to have the survey investigator go to the respondent and fill the time diary on their behalf, the same format, 24 hours, 15 or 30-minute slots, and having them asking them what activities they did during that time. And this is what we followed in our survey as well. The other is just an activity list where another survey, a major survey, will have a module on time use with an activity list asking people to report their average time spent on those activities. But yeah, we did follow a time diary approach with an interview method on that. And coming to the process, I think the most fulfilling part was actually of the survey implementation was actually being on the field, like undertaking that field work, interacting with respondents, and understanding the social factors that come into play in affecting individuals' behavior and their decision making. And survey implementation involves a range of steps, like several steps. And one of the primary ones to start with is to really understand the context of the population you want to study. So, and tailor the questions and design the survey in a way that it aligns with the social factors prevailing in the location. And that really involves like studying a lot in terms of their general structures, but also studying what existing surveys have been doing in that area, and then creating a survey out of it, designing some questions that are very specific to the study of the goal as well. So for example, in our case, we were very much interested in incorporating the role of gender norms and how that could be affecting people's time allocations. So we specifically included a range of questions on gender norms in our survey, which and also try to overcome the shortcomings of existing time use surveys by actually incorporating these background variables, they call it, which basically are variables that would help understand what people's time allocations are. And so yeah, that way we try to include those specific questions. And also we wanted to make the paper widely read and wanted some strong empirical evidence in the paper, because it's one of the, and to our knowledge, like the only study that has done this empirically to the extent that we've done it to assess the impact of unpaid work. So we wanted to present some good empirical results as well. And we knew it is a cross-sectional data, so wanted to employ a methodology like instrumental variable analysis to just overcome some biases in the analysis. And we specifically included questions that could act as efficient, or potential instruments for our analysis. And so that is very important. If you get a chance to implement a primary survey, it's important that you include variables that could really help you do a very extensive analysis. So all of this, of course, and then there were steps where we had to train the survey investigators, form a team of investigators, have them go on the field and collect data. And so it's a very, very fulfilling experience, I would say, of data of implementing a survey. And some of the social dimensions attached to it is that while interviewing, a lot of factors came up, like cultural factors, where sometimes it was difficult to gather data from the women respondents because they were hesitant, and also because the men counterparts in the household would not really have the women interact with the survey investigators unless they are also females. So those kind of hurdles, and then they would be around in the vicinity, which would affect the way the women respondents would be reacting or answering. So that way, there is still like a stigma where women respond, especially in rural areas where we did the survey. There it was very evident that women were not very comfortable talking, especially if the men were around. And we also very clearly saw the gender division of work, especially in sharing of domestic chores, maybe not as much in sharing of childcare. Their men were also kind of active, but in terms of childcare, in terms of domestic chores, it was a very clear-cut division of this very clear-cut gender division. Then we also observed some forms of simultaneous activities that women were involved in. They're doing a lot of agricultural activities, but also supervisory care, and sometimes even cooking, listening to music, also taking care of children, and then still classifying that as leisure time. They would not even recognize that this is not leisure time because they're doing so many different activities in that time. So those kind of social factors really came up. And I think that only data could not have captured. When we were there on field, we could observe these things and present a case study out of it. Maybe that the numbers couldn't have reflected that all of this that well.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, like I've just learned so much from this really this recap of what you've done, and I'm just so fascinated because I do time use research myself, and I'm like, all these different thoughts, I'm like, I wouldn't even have considered, right, when you're doing like a national survey versus the actual field work when you really dive into it, especially what you mentioned about the cultural norms and the patriarchy that is involved.
Yes.
So fascinating stuff, like
Right.
fascinating.
It's really very evident. It's not like you have to put in a lot of effort to observe
Yeah.
it. It's all there, like you're just observing it.
Yeah,
So
and that's the downside of using, the national survey sometimes, right? Is that you're not able to capture these elements. And one of the things that is missing in economics, right, is that, oh wow, I'm just like blown away, honestly. I'm just so fascinated by this.
good.
You have another working paper, right,
Yeah.
that is called Why Care for the Care Economy, Empirical Evidence from Nepal. And in that paper, you use the capability approach framework. So can you describe really what that is and why it's important or helpful, and discuss the importance of studying care economy in the context of Nepal?
Okay, yeah, I'll just go over that. So yes, we did use the capability approach framework to understand the consequences of unpaid caregiving, and this capability approach, first conceptualized by Amartya Kumar Sen, a great economist, is really a departure from the mainstream understanding of well-being, which is in terms of utility maximization and income expansion. It does consider income to be an important component, but rather understands well-being more as expansion of individuals' capabilities and functionings, which are basically their ability to do things and to kind of pick an opportunity that they value the most. So those expansion of freedoms are conceptualized as well-being. And it's a normative, non-monetary approach, which is such that it does value income resources and other non-monetary resources, but of course, focusing more on this ideal way of expanding people's functionings as the goal of economic and social policy. And we specifically wanted to use this capability approach because caregiving is one thing which, probably amongst others, but it's one thing that really feeds into well-being and human development through different mechanisms. So like caregiving in itself has been identified as a capability. So like you being able to care and affiliate with other human beings is a capability. And then secondly, care provisioning positively affects the care recipient's well-being. So whatever care you're providing it's very important for social welfare because it's positively affecting the well-being of the recipients. However, what we focused on was the negative impact of caregiving on the care providers. So when there is care work burden, and if it's solely done by women in the household or majorly done by women in the household, it could be affecting their capabilities negatively. And so these three different ways in which caregiving could be inputting into the broader human development idea of well-being, this is what we wanted to assess, and that's why this approach was the perfect to use. And we really built on Jackie Srini's 2020 paper and expanded the model to include the life cycle model to include some intergenerational effects of providing care and how the negative impacts could be compounding over time and then passing on to the next generation. So doing this in a capability approach framework also was important, because we didn't want to assess the binary paid, unpaid care work trade-offs, rather want to see how it could be affecting the consequences in a holistic picture. So that's why capability approach was an obvious answer. And, studying care economy in Nepal holds a lot of significance and importance and relevance, I would say, especially because, of course, it's a low-income country with strong patriarchal norms, and the cultural factors are such that very naturally it will be taken care within the household and by women within the household. So it's actually frowned upon if women or mothers are not taking care of children. So something like sending your child to child care centers, redistributing this work to the government is not like a cultural thing. It won't be taken very well. Even like sending your parents to elderly care centers is culturally not something, it's still a stigma there. So just saying that, redistributing this work from the household to the public sector or to men is not something that will be culturally very feasible to start with. So there are a lot that has to be done culturally. And one way to do that is to really expand on this research where we can show that what could be the consequences of women engaging in this unpaid work in large magnitudes and how that could be affecting their daily capabilities, including their education and employment responsibilities. And that's exactly what we did in this paper. And also there's a lot of evidence in Nepal where women have actually been, they are surveyed, and they reported to be willing to be working and doing some paid work, taking up some employment. But the primary reason they give for not doing that is their unpaid work responsibility. And even like reasons for not attending school is also unpaid work responsibility. So it's a thing, like they're doing it at a massive scale. And there is no public provisioning of care, like very limited public provisioning of care, of course, due to fiscal constraints, but also due to cultural factors, because, it's not something that will work out well.
Mhm.
And community caregiving is also low, like CRET system does not really exist that much to the extent that it exists in other Asian countries like India and so on. So in that way, studying the care economy in Nepal is very, very important. And it's important to also highlight these negative impacts on individuals' capabilities, to really highlight the foregone development trajectory that Nepal could be experiencing otherwise. And recognizing this unpaid work burden is the first step to expand time use surveys, of course, and trying to make that culturally not a stigma of redistributing this work from the household to the outside. Of course, it's an agricultural economy, so women are combining a lot of their agricultural work with caregiving. But even then, I mean, there is a lot of foregone developmental or expansion of in human capacities that could take place in Nepal if this care work is handled in a better way, I think.
Mhm. So your research also includes investigating the broader concept of social reproduction and its linkages with economic growth for the U.S. economy. So why is such an analysis important, and what social dimensions does it really encompass?
Right. So in this particular research, the underlying idea is to incorporate the role of social reproduction, which is a broader concept than unpaid care work, which includes care provisioning in the public sector and the market sector as well. So in the three sectors: household, public, and market. And this care provisioning, called social reproduction, like very in a very basic term, not very, like very broadly, I would say care provisioning could mean social reproduction taking place in the three sectors. And the distribution of this between men, women, and also among public and market sectors, that really affects economic growth and development. There are studies that have shown that. And I built on one of these models of Bronstein and other authors to examine the impact of increasing women's labor force participation on economic growth, being guided by the social reproduction regime that prevails. So basically, and why is this important to do, especially in the US also? Because there is very limited public provisioning of care in the US. And it has been identified as one of the only OECD countries, with no federal laws on paid parental leaves. Also, women and mothers are really struggling to combine their unpaid paid work responsibilities immediately after pregnancy. They're joining back work. There's very limited paid leaves that are available. And even a lot of people are living in childcare deserts. So the social structure of care provisioning in the US is such that it's very important to understand what kind of growth are we really experiencing here, and if that growth is really coming at the cost of somehow exploiting women's labor or at the cost of gender inequality. So if at all it is a inclusive or a gender equitable growth or not. And that's why this kind of an analysis is important. And the idea is that increasing women's labor force participation, of course, is good. But it's not the end of the story. If increasing women's labor force participation in a setting where there is adequate public provisioning of care, if men are sharing some bit within the household, and if there are also some availability of market substitution of caregiving, in that kind of a setting, increasing women's labor force participation would result in something called gender equitable or pro-care growth. But not doing that or increasing women's participation in the labor market in a setting where other forms of care provisioning is not adequate is a problem. And that is what I'm looking at in this paper. And the other social dimensions that really come into play is that the aspects of equitable growth, of course, and the inclusive development goals really are very important. And these social dimensions across having growth at the cost of one segment of the population should not be something called like really tolerated, I think. And also, like, undertaking this type of research becomes crucial to understand also the social structure prevailing. So I did this analysis at the state level, and there were so many differences if you compare something like Utah to California to New Jersey, so many different social structures in terms of providing care and in terms of care infrastructure and so on, that those kind of analysis are really crucial, specifically if you do it at a state level versus doing it at a country level, where some of these factors get, do not come into play that much if you're doing a country level analysis.
Yeah.
So
fascinating. And so we've seen that your research really spans with different themes. You have care work, time use, violence against women. You study economic methodologies, poverty in terms of income, as well as time poverty. But an underlying thread, right? A unifying thread here is gender. So why is it so important to consider gender in economic analyses?
yes, yeah, that's one question. I mean, thanks for asking that, I would say. But yeah, considering gender in economic analysis is very crucial, because this is one form of segregation of the population that we see. Of course, there are so many other inequalities, and I also delve into other intersectional inequalities, of course, focusing more on gender, because at least during my graduate program. So I base my research on doing gendered analysis. Specifically, I think, why is gender important? Because gender equality is, at a very basic level, a human rights concern, right? It should not, and I mean, it cannot be tolerated while doing economic analysis. Why should it be tolerated that somebody, based on their gender or social identity, they are not facing similar opportunities? So it's an ethical and a fairness concern in that way. And then research has widely showed that gender inequality can hamper economic growth outcomes. So even if we're talking as economists, like, it will affect economic growth negatively in various ways. And that's why it's important to include gender in studying these outcomes. And gender inequality also have a range of human development costs. So within the household, going to the societal level, a range of human development costs that can only be taken care of if we include gender in the analysis, like in taking into considerations girl child's and boy child's human development in very different ways. And then for effective policy making, like, it has been recognized in the policy space that gender equality is one of the major sustainable development goals, and also equitable growth and inclusive growth is something that are major goals in the policy space. So why not, like, include gender more consciously while doing economic analysis, to expand research on these topics, just to make policies more informed about these dynamics. And then also, I think, again, like, coming from India, I think that has a lot to do in this also, because I have witnessed these inequalities and a range of other inequalities. And I think when we talk about social economics, or the role of social structure, social interactions and culture, the role of gender naturally comes into play. And it is one thing that could also open door for a range of other intersectional analysis. So you can do gender with different caste levels. A lot of studies have looked into that in India. And then gender versus nationality also. So a lot of intersectional analysis could be done if primarily we are starting to focus on gender in that way, like considering gender as a unit of analysis versus homogeneous population. So in those kind of ways, I think gender really would inform economic outcomes, and it really needs to be studied in a way so that we are not getting blinded by these inequalities that would be affecting economics very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thank you. My goal, or one of my goals with this podcast, is really to highlight our scholars within the ASE. So where can listeners find you or follow your research and read more about you?
Sure. So my email, you can always reach out. It's asinha@levy.org, and then my website, aashimasinha.com. I'm also available. I'm also there on Twitter and LinkedIn. And the official Levy page also talks about my contact details. So they're
perfect.
Yeah.
And we'll link everything in the show notes as well.
Okay.
So I really want to end our discussion with looking forward. It's kind of my sign off thing. So what do you envision the future of social economics looks like?
The future, yes. So I think, of course, social economics is definitely the right path through which we can integrate and expand the role of social structures and processes in economic research and policy making. I would really envision social economics to be answering some very crucial questions and solving the challenges associated with the range of outcomes. And for example, something like climate change, which is just around everywhere. And I think social economics has a lot of potential to answer a lot of those questions and also mitigate some of those challenges, especially because climate change has a lot of social and cultural dimensions attached to it. And then beyond that, like studying more mitigating challenges in low and middle income countries through incorporating the role of social dimensions, challenges, as I said, associated with care work and gender inequality. So I think basically social economics going forward has the potential to answer and solve a lot of these challenges that our society would be facing and is facing right now.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you being here. It's been a wonderful experience.
Thank you so much, Iris. I really enjoyed our talk today. Thank you so much.